Okay, well, welcome back. We've finished the warm-up for our workshop. Time now to have a bit more of a look at what I'm talking about with this DPACT idea. Now, this little acronym that's popping up, I call it DIPA, and that stands for Discovery, Instruction, Practice, and Application. Now, why would I put this together? Well, um, it's useful to have a basic set of principles and ideas and techniques to refer to when you're reviewing your own teaching. When you're going through planning processes and reflecting on what happens in the classroom. And to me, it's important that it's a fairly simple sort of thing, something that's very accessible. And in my case, over a couple of decades of teaching, this is probably one of the strongest little sort of summaries of what I think is important about teaching. Um, and these elements of discovery, instruction, practice, and application, they certainly work well as a basic template for the way some lessons can progress. But not all lessons will have all those elements, and not always in that order, of course. But across my general teaching approach, I hope that, or across a series of lessons or across a general course, I would hope that all of these elements are present, as well as this idea of critical thinking. Now, the reason that critical thinking is there with brackets is because it's what I would call a floating element. It's an element that I think can be embedded in any of those deeper stages. It's not something that follows up from the four stages there. It's something that would go into that process in one or more of those stages. So that's why it's in brackets and it's at the end there. Now, the three elements in the middle there, instruction, practice, and application, I think they're fairly common in most teachers' approaches. I think they're fairly well understood. They're often applied, and they do sort of form a core or the guts, I guess, of most teaching approaches. But these elements of discovery and critical thinking, I don't always see them in the way teachers go about their work. And certainly early on in my teaching career, they certainly weren't all that present. They're two very important elements that I've learned to use a lot more in my teaching. And those two elements in particular result for me in a lot more engagement. And in the warm-up, I asked, what's the most challenging part of effective teaching for you? For me, it's very much the idea of engagement, because if you can keep learners engaged and keep yourself engaged, learning seems to sort of take care of itself. If engagement is there, things can be learned. It certainly enhances the capacity for learning to take place. So discovery and critical thinking, I think, are really important for engagement, and they are very important for these three middle elements of instruction, practice, and application to be more effective. In addition to that, I think in terms of the instruction, the practice, and the application, I like to give myself a couple of reminders in the form of questions. Is the instruction accessible? Is the practice applicable? And is the application actual? And they're the three A's that I like to always ask myself when it comes to the instruction, the practice, and the application. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in the next part of this little part of the workshop. So let's have a look at this idea of discovery. Now, one of the ways I've sort of like to think about this notion of discovery is sort of two directions. One on the left being more sort of the emergent side of discovery, and on the other side, more sort of going out into the learning process itself. So just starting with the arrow coming towards us there. To me, discovery is, as a teacher, I need to discover what the learners already know, and they need to discover what they already know. In order for us to effectively start where they are at. If we don't discover what they already know, how they feel, what gets, what works for them, we can't effectively start any sort of instruction or learning effectively until we have that starting point. In addition to that, I think it's a good idea to encourage the learners to predict or guess what's going to be learned. And to do that, it's often a case of just asking simple questions like what, where, how, and why. And it's good to create that sense of, we're going to learn something, we're going to do something. What do you think we're going to learn? How are we going to learn it? Why are we learning it the way we are learning it? Those sorts of questions. It's good to create that sense of prediction in the learners, and hypothesizing. Now, those two sides of the discovery road, I guess, are important. With the finding out what they already know and starting where they're at, that's very important in order to motivate via recognition. When learners, get some recognition that they already do know something, that's quite motivating for them. And it's motivating to know that the teacher is making this effort to adjust the instructions so that we can start with where they're already at. And that can be very motivating for learners, and it's good to, especially with disengaged learners or unmotivated learners, it's good to show them that they do have skills and that they do know things already. And what we're doing is actually, in any teaching or learning, we are really starting with something that's already there and then attaching something to that and extending it. These learners are not empty vessels that we pour new knowledge and skills into. There are already existing skill sets there, and I think we've really got to make an effort to find out what they are. And in terms of the predicting or guessing what's going to be learned, I think that creates an investment in learning, and it really does capitalize on the learner's creativity. If we can get them to think, what's going on, what's going to happen, how's it going to happen, that's a creative process. And when they start to make these predictions and guesses and think about it, they are almost automatically starting to invest in this learning process. So they're the sort of broad principles that I associate with discovery. Moving on to the idea of instruction. And you may recall I said one of the key questions I need to ask myself in terms of the instruction part of learning, is it accessible? And I've got a series of questions that I like to ask myself about that too. When there's instruction where we're showing learners how to do something or explaining how it works, or showing them what to do, does it involve discovery, which was in that previous slide? Are we moving on from the discovery stage? Are we incorporating their guesses and their predictions? Are we starting where they are at before we start to instruct? The other thing is it multimodal? And by that mean are we giving them different styles of instruction? Sometimes it could be visual, sometimes it can be auditory. In fact, the best will incorporate multiple modes of passing on information. It could be written, it could be something that they listen to, it could be something that they see, and I think the more modes that are present, the more chances we have of reaching more learners in more ways. So is the instruction multimodal? And I think if it is, it creates more access to that instruction. Does it allow for focus? There are all sorts of ways learners can be distracted. They can get information overload. They can, not know what in the instruction is most relevant or important for them. So does my approach to instruction allow some sort of focus? Can it be reviewed? Now, rather than reviewed, I'm saying reviewed. Even particularly myself as a learner, I don't always get things the first time around. And a lot of people are like me. When they sit in a class and something's explained orally or through a series of instructions on the board and then they're wiped out, I often don't get it the first time. And I think if instruction is going to be accessible, learners need to be able to re-access it as many times as they need in as many ways as possible. So can it be reviewed to make it accessible to them? Is it confirmed? Do we make sure that the learners are actually understanding the instructions? Do we have stages and processes to ensure that they're actually, getting this instruction? And is it committed to memory? Like, is there anything in our approach that ensures that as the learners are, being exposed to instructions, is there anything in our approach that makes sure that, or enhances the chance of them actually remembering it? So that's another question. And the final question, and this is the hook into the next stage, will it support practice? If we're going to ask learners to practice something, well, did the instruction set up that practice? Does it support it well? And if it's reviewable instruction, then hopefully during the practice stage, if the learners need it, they can come back and look at the instructions again. Let's go on and have a look at the idea of practice. And the question I pose for practice is it applicable? Now the questions I have in terms of that are, is there a supporting instruction? There's the link back to the previous stage or slide. If we're going to practice something, do we have supporting instruction, and can we access that as many times as we need? Is it perceivably relevant? Now there's a big mouthful there for you. Often when we get learners to practice something, well, if it's been organized properly and planned properly, usually it will be relevant, but that doesn't mean that they perceive it as being relevant. So a question I like to ask myself is, even though I know this is relevant, am I ensuring that they can see that it's relevant? Are they seeing, what the purpose of this practice is? Is it closed or open practice? Both of them are very useful forms of practice, but with the closed practice, we're looking at more of a focused practice, more controlled. Maybe we are supervising it much more closely. And then with the open practice, we're getting more towards sort of application, where the practice is less set, where there's perhaps less right or wrong processes or right or wrong answers. And open practice becomes a little bit more experimental. Is it sufficient? Or is it over sufficient? Is it too sufficient? We can't always assume that if we put in a couple of practice activities that that's going to be enough for the learners. But at the other end of the spectrum, we can overdo it as well. We can practice it to death. So I like to ask myself that question. Is the practice sufficient, or am I actually overdoing it? Again, as per the instruction, am I confirming this practice for the learners? Am I showing them that they're doing it right? Am I showing them that they're on the right track? Are there stages in the practice where they can get that feedback and those notifications that they're heading in the right direction or they're doing things the right way? Is it terraced or cumulative? And I like that use of the word terrace there, because it is related to the idea of being cumulative. And by that I mean, does one kind of set of practice lead on to another set of practice? If we practice a foundation set of skills, the next time we come back and practice something, do we get to use those foundation skills again, or do those foundation skills lead very naturally into the next stage of practice? So, and that creates a terraced approach to practice, where we move up as we go. Our one layer of practice can draw on the practice below it. And in turn, the practice we do now will help us do some sort of practice later. So that's another question. And again, one of our hooks here, will this support independent application? Now, when we're practicing, we have this idea of being observed and being helped and being monitored. But, is that practice organized in a way that we can eventually move on to some sort of application where the learners can do stuff on their own? Moving into the application idea, and the question I asked for application, is it actual? So when we get the learners to apply their skills and do something, well, are they actually going to produce something that's real? And are they going to produce something that is potentially useful, real and useful? Does the application that we do with the learners, does it link to discovery? Now, it can link to discovery in two directions. One is it could confirm or consolidate or provide some answers to that earlier discovery stage that we talked about, where we got them to predict and guess what they're going to learn and why they are learning it and how they're going to learn it. Does the application sort of inform that initial discovery process? And seeing it as a cycle, when we go ahead and apply our skills and do some sort of application, well, hopefully we're going to discover other things that we can learn or other things that we need to learn. So application here can actually lead into a new round of discovery for new skills and new practice and new instruction and that sort of thing. Is it supported? Is our application supported by useful and relevant instruction and practice? Now, when we set them loose, so to speak, and they do something independent or on a bigger scale, do they have that access back to the practice and the instruction that we talked about earlier to help them do this application? If they stumble or if they can't remember something, can they go back and re-access that instruction and that practice? And did that instruction and practice really build up their motivation, build up their skills, build up their competence to actually go ahead and apply those skills? Now, the last little thing I want to mention here is critical thinking. And, that's a really good question. What is critical thinking? Well, this is a pretty good example of showing what critical thinking is not. We've got the learner there and the teacher saying, look, just go to www.criticalthinking.com and click on answers. And that's kind of the antithesis to critical thinking. Another way of looking at it is, critical thinking is just the ability to make decisions based on an informed and effective thinking process. And look, it's definitely a really complex thing with lots and lots of different considerations and words associated with it, as you can see from this Wordle here. And it can be really sort of intimidating to contemplate critical thinking. And if you look at all those terms and words, you might be thinking, it's too complicated. And this chart here also shows you just how complex this idea of critical thinking can be. But look, the three main things, I guess, that are worth thinking about for critical thinking are the ideas of questions, process, and traits. And as I've highlighted there in the diagram, the idea of connections. And to me, that's what critical thinking really is about. It's having questions, it's having good processes that encourage connections, and then developing traits in the learners that allow them to make those connections more on their own, in a bigger range of circumstances. And this picture here is a nice sort of summary of it for me as well. The idea of having questions, and either generating questions or dealing with questions, having processes that allow us to work our way through those questions and come up with results, develop the sorts of traits that we want in the learners to think and make informed decisions, or even more questions. But that's kind of, to me, what critical thinking is all about. Questions, process, traits, just that ability to actually think about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and in our heads modeling what could happen and what the results of something could be, and why that could be good or bad. So that's kind of a quick wrap up of DIPACT, the idea of discovery, instruction, practice, application, and this floating role of critical thinking. And as I mentioned, these are just in my little clever acronym. These are things that I need to constantly remind myself of as a teacher. I don't always apply them all very well, but when I go and reflect on what I do, these are the questions that I ask myself. These are the questions that help me improve what I do as a teacher, and making sure I get really effective, engaging classrooms with learners.